This is a lecture about one of the main schools of thought in international relations theory known as liberalism. It's also about how many of the ideas in liberalism can be found in the works of modern art, particularly the works of abstract expressionist painters in the mid-20th century. Liberalism is the idea in international relations theory that human beings fundamentally value freedom and prosperity and are very willing to work rationally towards it and fight for it. And it is also the idea that cooperation should be the primary organizer in how countries interact with one another. Under liberalism, like its sister theory realism, political states in the form of governments leading countries are the primary actors in the international system. Liberalism asserts that in order for countries to stay prosperous and to maintain their freedom, they must pursue a path of interconnectivity and interdependency economically as well as politically, and foster as much cooperation as possible in order to avoid distrust and uncertainty, which can lead to situations such as armed conflict or large-scale wars. Liberalism's loyal assistant is what's known as democratic peace theory, which is the idea that this world of cooperation, peace, and prosperity is more attainable between countries that are democracies. If you are a classical liberal, you believe in the idea of liberal democracy, most likely mixed with some form of a market economy, and you believe that your shared political system of democratically elected governments mixed with open trade policies will ensure a world of cooperation and security for everyone. Famous liberal thinkers have included Voltaire, John Locke, Adam Smith, and Immanuel Kant. There is also neoliberalism, a term more familiar to most today, as defined by multiple thinkers, one of which is Robert Cohen, who wrestled with topics surrounding democratic peace theory. And it's a school of thought that, although birthed in the Enlightenment period in Europe and having a huge influence on the founding principles of the United States, but in many ways did not see its heyday until the era after World War II, when the power system of European colonialism, largely structured by realist political theory, came to an end, and an American-led international system built off of promoting liberal democracy and open markets at its core became the lay of the land in what became known in the Cold War as the free world, and what is known in the aftermath of the Cold War as the global community, or if you prefer a little more theatrics, the liberal international order. That order as we know it today is colored by the tenets of liberalism, interconnected markets, liberal democracy, also the idea that although the state is the primary actor in international relations, it's not the only important actor. It involves international bodies such as the UN, WTO, IMF, World Bank, the International Criminal Court, and the European Union. These institutions and others like them were conceived with a liberal framework to reduce the chances of conflict between the United States and its allies, as well as facilitate economic cooperation. And most of them were set up, conceived of, or made stronger in the aftermath of World War II, where the decimated European and Japanese imperial states left a power vacuum that was filled by the United States and Russia. Now, as most of us already know, Russia and its allies under the Soviet Union and the United States and its allies under the moniker of the Free World or the NATO alliance or what have you, had two very different visions for how the world should organize itself and how the international system should work. And in the aftermath of World War II, both ramped up their propaganda campaigns to win support, or in some cases at least obedience, from people all around the world. One small part of that story, but one that I think really fleshes out the ideas behind liberalism, is the work of abstract expressionists, the ideas behind their work, and particularly their central figure, Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock is responsible for a very famous painting known only as Convergence. Convergence is a giant canvas covered with abstract flung bits of paint and droplets of paint in different colors, shapes, and sizes swirling around in a giant mess that, depending on how you look at it, is both sort of calming and harmonious or chaotic and distasteful. And that split reaction to Pollock's painting Convergence is somewhat of a mirror to the split reaction the world has had towards liberalism. That can be better seen if we first explain what abstract expressionism is. Abstract expressionism, first and foremost, is an American artistic movement where painters mostly put together images that were just supposed to represent their raw feelings and in-the-moment sensations. Now, a lot of different people were a part of that, painters like William de Kooning, others, but the big hero of that movement in the world of culture in the time of the late 40s and early 50s was Jackson Pollock. And Jackson Pollock was kind of a rugged, cowboyish drinker character. He was from Wyoming, but he'd come to New York, and he was making what went on to be his famous drip paintings in the late 40s. So right after World War II. Now, one of the biggest criticisms of abstract expressionism was essentially kind of this, it's just a bunch of drops on a canvas. It's abstract. My kid could do this, or it's so simple, it doesn't require the skill of being a real famous, talented artist. So when Jackson Pollock rose to popularity, immediately there was a backlash of to what degree this did not represent classical art. Now, in the world of abstract expressionism, that's the whole point. Up until really the late 1800s and early 1900s, the tradition of art in European society was a pretty strict affair. You had people who drew and painted things as they saw them, kind of just photocopying what they saw or attempting to. And in the world of art, especially with the advent of photography and a whole lot of other technological changes in the world, people started to see art and themselves differently. From basically the Middle Ages all the way up to the 20th century, most people saw art as the thoughtful replication of images in the real world as they really existed. And this was sort of the goal of art. Portrait painters, people decorating the homes of wealthy elites, all the like. But starting in the late 1800s, with people like Paul Cézanne, or to some degree even Vincent van Gogh, you get people painting not so much what they saw out in the real world, but a representation of the real world as it was emotionally felt by the viewer of that place, the artist. That's where you get Van Gogh with his crazy skies and his colorful trees and his deliberately simplified sort of dreamlike paintings. That's where you get Pablo Picasso changing the placement of eyes and noses and mouths almost to make them more visible to your eye than if they were just neatly in place in the spots on the human face that you would expect them to be. And that process continued for decades and decades and decades, and many would argue that went all the way to a certain way of thinking, which is embodied by Jackson Pollock, where it's like, what if there was no representation or realism at all? So this is a big, giant middle finger to traditional art and traditional thinking itself. This is the beginning of the age of the individual in a globally connected world after the fall of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, in a world where America is fighting for its idea of what freedom is and how freedom should appear to individual people. Now, the other power at that time after World War II is obviously the Soviet Union, which had its own sort of hauntingly beautiful and terrifyingly conformist realist art, so they were not doing individualistic, abstract, expressionist art. Soviet art was primarily images of very burly men and women working in fields or building buildings or doing very, very worker stuff in the most kind of simplistic sense of the word. You've got literal sickles and hammers. I mean, that's why you've got the communist symbol of sickles and hammers, right? It's about a workers' revolution, a world made for workers. Everyone plays a small but critical role in the collective whole, and their art wanted to embody that. It's a much more conformist society, right? So the polar opposite of that is a thinking, feeling, independent individual person who determines their own destiny and is not just another honeycomb in the beehive that is embodied in the collectivized art of the Soviet Union. So this is where things get really interesting, because you've got artists in different parts of the world that are obviously making a wide array of art about a wide array of subjects, but the question isn't necessarily who is the greatest artist of the age, but which artists get elevated by the society of the time. It's pretty straightforward why the Soviet Union would favor and elevate images that emphasize the role of the worker in society, because communist Soviet Russia was all about the myth of the workers' revolution, just as American culture is about the myth of the free, spontaneous, rugged, self-determining individual as embodied by, sometimes most commonly, some sort of cowboy character, right? Then enter Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock is this wild drinker character who's in New York making these crazy paintings which kind of fit the narrative of the day. You know, you can go into the life of Jackson Pollock and find out a lot more kind of esoteric details about who he was and why he did what he did, but at the end of the day, the context of his art was pretty profound. This is right after World War II. America needs a narrative for why it's worth supporting versus the Soviets. It's not really clear yet which of these two superpowers are going to win the day in the long run. So if the Soviets stand for workers, conformity, some sort of humility, what's America stand for? Well, kind of the exact opposite. If the Soviets are atheists, Americans are religious. If the Soviets are about conformity, Americans are about individuality. But then what ideology could really represent that in a political sense? Because we have our Soviet communist workers mental model, which is deciding how the Soviet art world is taking form. What about the American art world? America is still, at least culturally, kind of seen as a backwater, right? It doesn't have the pomp and the history of the former European colonial powers who, although not without their own problems, can at least trace back a lot of popular art and high art to their countries, their histories, their cultures, their religions, their intelligentsia, right? So you've got this sense of French Impressionism or Italian Renaissance painting or ancient Greek sculpture. There are these kind of anchor points of what we consider high-level art that are very obvious in the minds of at least people in the Western world at that time that are associated with places in Europe. In America, not so much. You have sort of the Romantic era movement, some painters there, but you know, the art world is still seen as this rock star universe that's run primarily by places like Paris, not New York. But that was all about to change. And that change in many ways started because of how many European artists started moving to New York during the 30s and 40s. Let's remember, what was one of the things that the Nazis were doing when they were in power in Europe? They were destroying modern art. They were finding anything that did not represent sort of a classical approach to art, a photocopying, if you will, of the human form or of some sort of Greco-Roman model of architecture, and they were straight up burning it. So a lot of people, for political reasons or for creative reasons, just fled Europe at that time, and many ended up in New York. So now you have this world in America that's emerging that's very anti-authoritarian. You have the liberation of Europe after the end of World War II. You have a need to build an anti-Soviet narrative in your cultural sphere. And you have a lot of artists in New York making a lot of interesting images. And not that those images have to necessarily be the most profound or the most skillful applications of brush to canvas ever created, but they have to be informed by a new type of thinking that can embody a new era in American culture and politics as the American state tries to assert its dominance in a world where it is contested by the Soviet Union and where it also must look like a liberator in the aftermath of the fascist universe of World War II that destroyed Europe. Artistically, you're probably getting to the point where it's clear where this is going. That new type of thinking was embodied by Abstract Expressionism, and Jackson Pollock was its poster child. Jackson Pollock took giant canvases, threw them on the ground, and randomly dripped huge brushes of paint over his canvas over and over, layering on top of it colors, blotches, and just wild pathways from his hand just swirling around in the air as the paint dropped, right? It's sort of the ultimate expression of just random automatic thinking and feeling and sort of cartographizing it, right? It's sort of a map of his spontaneous movement more than it's really representing physical reality. It's a personal map of his subjective universe. But it's also just a bunch of blotches on a piece of canvas, however mesmerizing or infuriating your eye finds them. And then this is really where the actions of Jackson Pollock start turning into the legend, the myth, and the kind of intellectualism of Jackson Pollock. And that's where things get a little more political in some way. The intellectual side of Pollock is he's not creating a portrait of something that exists out in the world. He's not creating a landscape that one can see if they step out their window. But he is, to some degree, creating some sort of rough map of his state of mind. For whatever random reason, his hand goes one way or the other while there's paint on his paintbrush. And as it falls, you get sort of a seismograph of his chaotic and troubled mind, right? Because Jackson Pollock was a terrible alcoholic and, probably not the happiest dude on the planet, but he represented something that Americans and American leaders, as we'll later discuss, connected with. And that is a map of the individual feelings of a bold, brash, adventurous human being. But I would argue that there's a price to this boldness and this color and this incoherent, raw expression with no discernible form. Even though it's very mesmerizing to some and very controversial to others, its universalness is in some ways its weakness. So what's strong about the Jackson Pollock is also what's weak about it. It's in one sense accessible and immediately in your face, and you can kind of get behind the aesthetics of it and can be charmed by the character that put it together. But it also doesn't have a really coherent, identifiable body. That strength of rawness and accessibility and that weakness of undefinable just blobs of color simultaneously is something I would think is worth holding on to when we think about the great political moment in international relations theory that was happening at the time of Jackson Pollock, and that is the idea of liberalism. Now, this isn't liberalism like liberals, hippies, or being socially liberal. This is really the political ideology of liberalism as it refers to statecraft and how the world is held together. Liberalism is the idea that rejects a much older idea in international relations known as realism. I have a lecture on realism as well, but the primary idea to understand about realism in this talk is to understand that realism was the idea that the best way for people to pursue stability and safety in their world is to collectivize under a strong political state, so a government that leads a country, and make sure that you are militarily and economically strong to protect yourself from other countries that are trying to get militarily and economically strong. And you need to build alliances that ensure something of a balance of power. Now, this idea emerged largely in Western Europe, where there had been countless wars over territory between neighboring countries that were all concerned about being invaded by each other. So the logic was power defines what happens in statecraft, not ideology. But that power dynamic also had a lot of consequences. If you just narrowly pursue your national state's interests, to make your state as strong as possible, and everything is really just a linear power game, the whole world turns into a chessboard. There's no sense of shared goals or common humanity. It's an all-against-all world that is basically anarchy, right? It's an anarchical situation where countries don't have permanent allies, just permanent interests. Values don't come into play. It's all about winner takes all, zero-sum game, the strong survive. Now, there are advantages to thinking that way, but the consequences, especially in the late 40s, were just astoundingly dire. I mean, the pursuit of national power at any cost was what led to really fueling ideologies of European nationalism, Nazism, to some extent even the Soviet nationalism in Russia. So it made for a violent and authoritarian world where people were very much unsafe. So at the time, the thinking was this kind of logic, especially in the eyes of the Americans who had basically come to inherit Western Europe, needs to go. Or the more cynical view would probably be this needs to go for the Europeans. For American power projection did not stop, as we all know, after World War II. War production continued, the Cold War got more intense, and that leads us up into the present day. But at the very least, ideologically, liberalism as put forward by the United States after World War II was embodied in the idea that countries need to find new and innovative ways of cooperating, collaborating, and hashing out their differences in a civil, multilateral format. And it was in the late 40s that you really saw the takeoff of organizations like the United Nations. The UN building being first constructed in New York in 1948, at the same time that Jackson Pollock was becoming an abstract expressionist superstar in the minds of the American public and on the New York art scene. So here's where these worlds converge. Liberalism is all about the idea that realism has to go, no more power for power's sake. And the American sort of salt in the soup is also that the Soviets are wrong too. For let's not forget, although Soviet Russia was not successful, it also offered another internationalist model. Lots of countries had communism. So the American flavoring of liberalism was also that, not only was that old world Europe way of thinking, that neoclassical, realist kind of warrior culture, a primitive and dangerous thing, but the Soviet threat, with its conformity and its dominance of everyday life and its suppression of the individual, was also a danger. So this is where you get your abstract expressionists suddenly becoming a lot more popular. And this isn't some sort of wishful correlation of mine. You can look up the Congress for Cultural Freedom and you can see examples of how agencies within the United States government did support certain artistic, musical, or literary movements or figures who were just independently making art that represented a lot of the ideas that the Americans wanted to represent at that time, to compete with Soviet culture, Soviet ideology, and win a battle of hearts and minds. If you've ever seen the old cartoon Animal Farm from the writer George Orwell, that's a famous example where that was just literally bankrolled by the CIA. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It just is a fact. And it's one of those examples of where the political and economic sort of strings of the time pull the art world in a certain direction and push certain people to prominence. Now, that's not to say Jackson Pollock wasn't a brilliant painter in his own way. Obviously, whether you are a fan of his technical skill with how he drops paint onto canvas is a totally different matter, but he was obviously, to some degree, aware of the context of what he was doing in the art world, and so were art critics in the United States. So Jackson Pollock was in the right place at the right time. He wanted to sort of be the cowboy of high art, and he very much succeeded. Now, whether he really cared about fame, I don't actually know enough about his life to know that. But he was someone that sought to be an artist and express himself in a way that was very much coincidentally in line with goals of the United States at that time. And for that reason, he was celebrated by art critics in New York who, as said earlier, kind of wanted to move the center of gravity of high art from places like Paris to places like Manhattan. And his work represented a rugged, raw, spontaneous individual who determined their own destiny, which was a core message to the American people at that time and to allies of Americans during the Cold War. And it's a facet of liberalism that the state is not necessarily by itself the most important actor in international affairs. You have multilateral institutions. You have economic interdependency. Liberalism is all about the idea that it is critical that countries, individuals, and other institutions create situations of interdependency and cooperation. And it's liberalism and the American spearheaded form of liberalism that started after World War II that is largely responsible for how the great majority of leaders in the United States and Western Europe think today, right? This is the idea of promoting certain forms of government, certain forms of economics, certain forms of human rights that are responsible in many ways for why living standards are so high in the West, why businesses can thrive in Western countries. The darker side is it can also be a way of thinking that inspires a lot of dangerous interventionalist thinking. It's been the basis for why Americans got involved in the Iraq War, why the United States often sees itself as an exceptional country that has a unique privilege of being able to be morally in the right when it invades other countries. Now, there are substantive arguments for the United States having a role as a mediator in a world where it has the strongest military and where it played a disproportionate role in setting up the economic and political rules of the post-World War II world, and then had that role again in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But if you take that further to its furthest extreme, you run into a very weird meeting point of liberalism on paper and sometimes American nationalism in practice that can sometimes appear indistinguishable from liberal thinking. So many of the cynics of liberalism would say it's really a realist American infiltration with a somewhat disingenuous kumbaya sticker slapped on top. That's not to say that liberalism doesn't have distinct advantages over realism, and there isn't a lot we can learn from liberalism. It has been nothing short of the greatest international peace project in history that countries that were just killing generations of each other for centuries in Western Europe have now figured out how to cooperate. France no longer invades Germany. Germany no longer invades everybody else. Britain no longer sees a need to side with the weakest member of any land war to make sure that the European continent never unites against it. These were all problems in the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s. They fueled European colonialism. Remember, one reason Europeans started colonies in the first place, among others, was to gather enough raw materials and resources to strengthen their own militaries to protect themselves from invasion by the other Europeans that were also starting colonies. That world finally fell apart after the Second World War. And the beginning of American-led liberalism is also the end of European colonialism. Suddenly, when the world is no longer a security game, and America is handling your security needs, it's a lot easier in Western Europe to find reasons to cooperate. And that was the basis for the European Union. It started with the European Society for Coal and Steel, where France and Germany decided to integrate their coal industries. And the EU, as a supranational body, has gone that direction ever since. The more institutions you build in an interdependent way, the harder it is to basically attack each other. If Germans and French are using the same coal industry, the same power grid, the same roads, the same agricultural rules, following the same agreements on human rights, food safety, using the same currency, and then so are 20 plus other countries, you're going to have fewer and fewer incentives to basically invade each other. And that is proved unequivocally true for all of the shortcomings of the EU in terms of its speed and coherence in responding to international crises. If you compare it to what was happening in Europe before it, it's nothing short of a miracle that the world of Europe was able to somewhat come together. Now, there are challenges to that, there are disadvantages to that, but a modern European has a lot of reasons to be thankful for the European Union, just as there are reasons to be cynical about the European Union. But if you look at it from its original goal of creating interdependency to disincentivize reasons for war, it's been a success. Now, the other liberal international body that could also be behind that, let's not forget, is NATO, which originally drawn up as an alliance system for fighting the Soviets during the Cold War, also has a lingering value. America, as the sole superpower that backs NATO and is behind a lot of its most significant military weight, is kind of the guy at the head of the table. This means Europeans are not relying on a security apparatus that is disproportionately dictated by the French, the Germans, or anybody else. So when you take that security question out of the mix, it's much easier to also build businesses, institutions, and cooperative bodies between each other. Now, the controversial idea of America slowly abandoning NATO, that has been in popular conversation really since 2016, does have its ups and downs. Its ups might just be Americans not getting entangled in conflicts far away, but the downside would be if America were to theoretically fully pull out of NATO or just not play a role as a defender of Europe, then Europeans would have to figure out who they would like spearheading, organizing, and leading their defense efforts in case anything were to happen. That sounds not impossible, but if you look at the history of Europe, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty in that. Modern day Germany or France are not what they were 150 years ago, but the memory of those wars is definitely going to impact the perception of rearmed Europeans. You as a French person might not love the idea of German military spending going up. You as a Polish person might not love the idea of getting stuck between Germany and Russia as they build up arms again. You as a British person might be frightened by what would happen in a European conflict. Now, those things are kind of far-fetched in today's world, but it's worth pointing out that it is not totally clear what is really most strongly behind modern peace in Europe. Is it the fact that we've all learned not to kill each other and that we've created this world of economic and political interdependency where cooperation creates great opportunity and wealth? Or is it fundamentally a realist security guarantee by American force? The only way you would really be 100% able to answer that question would be if America just unilaterally pulled out of NATO. That being said, NATO and its underpinnings are essentially a liberalist institution. Now, some people might wonder if realism is all about military power and economic strength, how could NATO be a liberalist institution? And it is because NATO is a commitment between many rich countries to defend each other on the basis that they are liberal democracies. And this is where liberalism gets some strength again. Liberal countries, or countries that at least follow what liberalist institutions see as valuable, are countries with, fairly unregulated markets in the grander scheme of things, democratic institutions, a strong commitment to human rights, and a pretty transparent commitment to international trade. These are the basic tenets of liberalism. Build interdependency through trade, build a mechanism for mediating between different countries with international bodies like the United Nations, but also the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Economic Forum to some extent. That brings us to an interesting idea, which is the idea of the Davos man, which I believe is a term coined by the American political scientist Samuel P. Huntington. And it returns us to where even liberalism can become a victim of its own success. The Davos man is called the Davos man first and foremost because he is a representative of the kinds of wealthy executives, investors, CEOs, tech titans, oligarchs, name your rich guy trope, who attend the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. And the thinking behind the Davos man is that the Davos man has such a diverse and powerful financial portfolio that they have moneyed interests that span across the globe. And to such a crazy extent that what's good for them is either totally indifferent to or maybe even at odds with the needs of ordinary people in the countries that the Davos men come from. This is exactly why in populist rhetoric in the United States you get Steve Bannon, who, having worked at Goldman Sachs, is a Davos man somewhat himself, often referring to the Democratic Party and in the particularly the financial wing of the Democratic Party as the party of Davos. And that's really sort of the history of the second half of the 20th century. These international institutions set up under American supervision with American interests put forward and with a liberal ideology at the center end up making the world we have today, a global interconnected economy, one that was pushed by other rich countries because they saw an opportunity to make money, and one that at this stage in the 21st century is to some degree losing a lot of steam because it is becoming apparent that exploitation goes both ways. If it's the 40s and the 50s and you're in the United States, a liberal world is a great world, partially because you don't have any real economic competitors. As said earlier, Japan, China, Europe, I mean, the whole world except the U.S., every advanced country is essentially rubble and economically in a bad spot. So if you open up your markets to sell all your stuff to the rest of the world, it's a pretty sweet deal. But if you fast forward a couple of decades, what do you find out? Well, you find out South Koreans are pretty great at making flat screen TVs. Germans are pretty good at making cars. So are the Japanese. A lot of finished products that would have been maybe created in Pittsburgh are now being created in Indonesia. A lot of even European manufacturing. Action figures that would have been made in Italy in the 90s are being made in Vietnam. Now, these aren't necessarily bad developments, but as the interconnectivity gets more complex, it's not just a linear win-win anymore. There is a graph called the elephant curve, because of it vaguely being shaped like an elephant, which looks at wealth generation in the world over the last few decades. And what is abundantly clear when you look at the elephant curve is you find, first and foremost, the wealthy business world has benefited from globalization more than anybody. If you are a corporation headquartered in rich country X and you can sell to people in Asia, Africa, South America, North America, and Europe all at the same time, your profits are going through the roof. And wherever it's cheapest to set up shop, you can move things around. If it's cheaper to manufacture stuff in one Asian country versus another, you just move. If there's a good investment deal somewhere, you've got the capital to put stuff forward, and money can move fairly quickly. But what does that mean if you live in a particular place where money is moving away? If you are Davos man, you're just interested in where your money can be the most effective at making you more money. Doesn't matter where that is. But if you're an ordinary person going to work every day, this rapid moving of money around the globe can hurt you in horrendous and very difficult to recover from ways. That's the 2008 financial crisis. That's outsourcing. That's also just lower labor standards in developing countries. I mean, ordinary people face a lot of trouble when money can quickly move around the globe to wherever there's a accommodating regulatory or labor cost climate. It's not incentivizing general welfare for ordinary people. And then in places where it gets to a certain fever pitch, people get angry. And we normally think of that as something that happens in developing countries, but the elephant curve explains why it's also happening in developed countries. People with traditional jobs in manufacturing or other sectors that have been more spread out across the planet feel a economic insecurity that leads to a political backlash. So in a very real way, the money that was in some ways going towards the stable wage of a working class person in a rich country is now much more likely to be somewhere in a developing country doing good things, granted, pulling people out of extreme poverty, but now also not there in the same consistent way to guarantee a certain quality of life for, let's say, people without a college degree in the American Midwest. And this creates tension. This creates situations where what's good for the global whole isn't always good for segments of society in certain countries. And when those segments of society feel like the government doesn't have their back, this is where things get very, very testy. So this is where you also get the concerns in developing countries, because it's not just the elephant curve and the issues in rich countries where you have problems with liberalist thinking. This interconnectivity creates other problems as well. Free trade agreements, multilateral agreements between countries often favor the richer countries who have leverage to make more of the rules. If you are Mexico and you're making a free trade agreement with the United States, who is it more likely to disproportionately benefit? The person who has the negotiating power. And America, with the military and economic weight that it has, is going to have that power. But that can have consequences for the United States. One thing that happened with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement in the 90s, was that you end up reaching a conclusion of talks that agrees to have huge amounts of government-subsidized corn and agricultural products of all kinds enter Mexico. What does this do to the local economies of small farmers in Mexico? It obliterates them. Mexican farmers cannot grow crops with the efficiency and the price of large-scale American farming that's also getting a huge boost in its ability to lower prices from government subsidies. So you flood the market with cheap corn and other agricultural products. You put huge swaths of the Mexican farming community out of business. What do people in Mexico do? They migrate to the United States and work on the farms that put them out of business. This is why in the 90s you get a huge influx of immigration from Mexico to the United States. Now, once again, not coining that as a good or a bad thing, just a cause and effect relationship. A lot of people would argue that that is part of the free market. But then you could just as easily levy the other argument that how could it be the free market if America is unfairly competing with subsidized agricultural exports? And this is where you enter the messy, messy world of many interconnections, creating many different kinds of winners and many different kinds of losers. It starts to become less clear if you as an individual are winning or losing out of this. Liberalism and the interconnections that it facilitates creates that confusion it creates that bright, crazy, colorful wave of connections like that Jackson Pollock painting, but it also creates a fairly chaotic situation where it's hard to discern anything with a recognizable consistency. And what we are discovering in the 21st century in particular, from digital connections, economic connections, political connections between countries, non-government organizations, individuals, media companies, and the like, is that when you connect everything up almost arbitrarily for connection's sake, it's no more effective than power for power's sake at determining a safe and stable world. For when you connect people up, every opportunity to cooperate inadvertently brings with it an opportunity for conflict. People in the Middle East and Africa can end up rioting over a cartoon that was drawn in Denmark. Someone in North America can count on some level of global fame if they commit an act of violence with a weapon in a school or a place of worship thanks to social media. And social media might be almost as good a metaphor as Jackson Pollock for the arbitrary movements of raw feelings for the sake of raw feelings. And in recent years, that's exactly why the downside of social media has been so equated with the decline of what we often call a liberal international order. That so much nastiness has been exchanged on social media platforms in terms of abuse, in terms of juicing people up to get angry in their politics, and in terms of inducing them to be addicted to digital spaces that don't care what keeps them engaged just as long as they're engaged. You enter a really dark side of what it means to just pursue connection. To connect is to be bound with all sorts of things, both good and bad. And to say that facilitating connection is always a good thing is very, very naive. And those raw feelings that cause a drip painting or used to represent what we saw as a confident, strong individual are now sort of coming to be seen as a weakness. That sort of flamboyant, sort of just automatic, rugged individual is now being monitored by the very same companies that are encouraging sort of a caricature of this individuality. Share this, post that, tweet that. Your impression, your subjective, immediate perception of things is the most valuable thing. And it's not valuable because of some sort of democratic peace theory, but because you, as a confident, spontaneous, at least somewhat Americanized world citizen, are in the right when you are pursuing your unique passions in this raw, automatic, unconscious, Pollock-like subjective state is what makes you an empowered individual. Now, in the 40s, when you are trying to shake off the authoritarian past of a very recently nasty world, that spontaneous, raw part of the human spirit is a romantic and celebratory thing. It's even more worth celebrating if you can fit it into a portrait of the United States that is the arbiter of freedom. Now, where it becomes tricky in our time is when that same sentiment is, to some degree, consciously or not, now perceived to be working against us and in some ways against the tenets of liberalism. Let's remember, liberalism assumes that people are rational actors who pursue freedom and prosperity, and they do it through interconnectivity and by empowering individuals. The individual is very important to liberalism, and Jackson Pollock was very important to the narrative of the individual and their passions as set free by a free society to follow the path that they see fit, and that following this path leads to more freedom and more prosperity. But as has been observed in recent decades, we also know that the subjective tastes and preferences of free individuals can be, to some degree, weaponized against them and used to manipulate their mood or their perception of the world around them. When you are free to let your raw emotions run wild and to create a mental map of your inner anguish, your inner energy, your inner fears, the forces that govern your unfiltered feelings in the form of a Pollock-esque drip painting, you do leave behind a map of your inner mind. Now, in the case of a drip painting in the 50s or the 40s, that's a very crude and very symbolic representation of your innermost thoughts and feelings. But by the time we hit the 21st century, that map of your inner feelings is very real. It's based on data collection from some of the most successful companies on the planet. Every time you make a purchase, click an article, share an impression of something, there is a real quantifiable effect in the world which is measuring, to some degree with accuracy, your inner emotional state. And that information is used also to influence it. And this is the conundrum on the individual level of 21st century liberalism. The belief in liberal values on an international level starts with what the individual believes about his or herself. And that belief, for several decades now, has been rooted in the idea that you, as a liberal individual, are a rational actor pursuing rational aims in order to maximize your freedom so that you may go after and share the things that matter most to you. Pollock embodied this by literally pouring out his feelings with the help of paint onto a canvas for other people to observe and see. And in today's world, the modern global economy, running very much under the influence of fundamentally liberal ideas, has now produced a world of consumerism, advertising, and data collection that seems to suggest that you are not the rational actor you thought you were. And those passions you were pursuing, they can be manipulated. They are not solely under the jurisdiction of the self, the way they appeared to be in the time of Jackson Pollock. So if we take that Jackson Pollock painting Convergence for a second and use it as a metaphorical symbol for liberalism, suddenly those colorful, free, spontaneous motions don't feel so free anymore. They feel like the traces of a disturbed and somewhat chaotically unhinged human being who is more at the whim of larger forces than truly externalizing their own truth upon the world. If we look at the Pollock metaphor beyond the individual and look at it as it could represent the global system, each overlapping splash of paint can represent the many overlapping interests, ideas, and connections that contribute to the state of our world. And it just seems like each new transaction leaves us more and more confused. And as more and more lines and swirls enter the mix, it gets harder and harder for any single person to discern what this even is, where it's headed next, or what we even really think about it. All of that financial, political, and social interconnection, as embodied by, modern social media companies, brings with it the ghost of some of that Pollock vapidness, where you are faced with the fact that you are, in some ways, most valuable as an impressionable, emotionally somewhat erratic consumer who is addicted to certain habits, certain behaviors, and certain products, not unlike the instability in Jackson Pollock's own life and his alcoholism. Any kind of addiction is going to make you a more predictable person and leave you feeling less in control. Beyond just Pollock, a crisis of individual agency is not the only challenge to liberalism in today's world. Liberalism, in spite of its pursuit of a world where we are democratic, market-oriented, peace-loving people, also can be responsible for a great deal of military intervention and violence. It was the assertion that Saddam Hussein was a nasty dictator that was used to persuade the American public to invade Iraq and stay in it, and to invade Afghanistan and make it resemble a democracy. This is fundamental democratic peace theory, that democracies are less likely to go to war with one another, that fellow democracies should work together to make the world in their image to some extent. Most American presidents are ideologically liberals in the international relations sense of the word. You may be socially conservative, you may be religious, but you believe in a democratic, capitalist, interconnected world with America to some degree at the center. And it's actually really not until you get contenders economically, politically, socially, that these ideas start to fade in the United States from mainstream popularity. A lot of people are now a little bit disillusioned with markets and, frighteningly enough, even democracy, when it's not so clear they're a winner in that game. And when you're competing with countries like China, which maybe have had economic success, but certainly have not done that as a result of being particularly democratic. So liberalism has ushered in a lot of good things and a lot of bad things at the same time, and the result is kind of this swirl of drops and colors where when you stand back and look at it, it's a very chaotic looking thing. And it is also just very confusing. Now, that does not mean it's all in vain. Obviously, if somebody is living in a wealthy democratic country, they are grateful for their freedoms, for the human rights that are embedded into the rule of law in those places, for their ability to pursue their passions and their interests in their life and not be assigned a station that they must conform to. These are not bad ideas, and they certainly have served immensely humanitarian goals and have done great good for people all across the globe. We are in a time of prosperity that the overwhelming majority of humans in history would have killed to be at the bottom of the pyramid for. And we can enjoy a lot of the diversity of the world in ways we didn't before. And those are fantastically good things. And liberalism reminds us in its structure and in its confusion also that the world is a complex place and there are many ways of dealing with the same problem. It is not a zero-sum game. And informed, enlightened liberals are never going to tell you democracies will never go to war, interconnected countries with shared economic interests will never have military disputes, that complex trade agreements don't have losers and winners that don't always end up in fair circumstances. But the case holds that it is not a bad idea to make steps on the international stage that are meant to facilitate cooperation. It is that cooperation, that commitment to looking at things in more than one way, that keeps countries at the negotiating table instead of at war with one another. You really only run into trouble when you get too literalist about those ideas. Liberalism is a theory and a set of principles. It's not a law like gravity. Liberalism was in many ways what got the likes of Lyndon B. Johnson to get American GIs killed in Vietnam, the idea being domino theory. It was so important to make sure that the political and economic systems in Southeast Asia did not all become communist. He was willing to expend immense resources bombing, killing, and blowing people up in Vietnam to the great cost of Americans and Vietnamese alike. Not because there was some sort of strategic significance of Vietnam in the American geopolitical chessboard, but because of the idea of domino theory, the idea that all of the little countries that become communist will line up together and join forces against the United States. That definitely did not happen, but the commitment to the idea that Vietnam must exist in a political format that resembles the United States was a huge contributor to why that war went on so long and why so many people died. The principles that make up liberalism, when applied tactfully, can create a set of circumstances where cooperation is much easier to facilitate than conflict. If liberalism is read too narrowly, though, it can end up creating motivations for actions that lead to the same kinds of chaos and disorder that the principles of liberalism actually seek to mitigate and avoid. Liberalism, also like Pollock, is also just a victim of its own success in some ways. Pollock didn't live that long. He did a lot, but he died at 44. It might be slightly artsy and indulgent of me, but I think it's also worth pointing out that many of the critiques of liberalism bear similarity to critiques of Jackson Pollock's artwork, and that it's vapid, it's in bad taste, in the same way that Jackson Pollock embodies the kind of raw spirit of the American explorer, the American artist, the American individual, and his subjective tastes and preferences guiding his destiny. You see that amounts to a drip painting, which, although deliberately so, doesn't have a lot of thought put into it. And those critiques are also levied at a lot of aspects of globalization, consumerist culture, a society which puts individual tastes and preferences on a very high pedestal, right? This kind of idea of cheap junk that's in high supply. You see that people's often distaste for a sort of kind of Disneyland gift shop aesthetic is represented in kind of the automatic, quick and dirty approach of Jackson Pollock's artwork, whether you find it beautiful or not. I actually like Jackson Pollock paintings, but it's worth pointing out that Jackson Pollock and the art movement of the Abstract Expressionists did inspire and birth a much more cynical art movement, which we now know as pop art, which almost reveled in the kind of repetitive, pointless, and somewhat impulsive nature of the objects that were produced in a world ruled by mass manufacturing, global interconnectivity, and commercial interests reigning in such a high station. And it begs the question that if we are to build an interconnected world where everyone's individual desires, freedoms, and pursuits are respected, is it possible to do that in a way that's not so broad that the most important things we have in common are just a bunch of knee-jerk, animalistic, plastic impulses? If we're free to follow our desires, but our desires are also baseline so similarly manipulated by advertising, social media, or whatever can yank our lizard brain, are we really that free when we act on impulse, as we sometimes are told we are? Does sticking with our gut and following our base desire really lead us to a path of rewarding fulfillment and transcendence, or does it lead us to a dirty McDonald's parking lot? It's a valid question. In the end, we can thank liberalism to some great degree for creating societies so prosperous that we can even ask these kinds of questions. And those questions come in across the political spectrum. They are questions like, if you're more progressive, how can rich countries like the United States say they stand for freedom and democracy when so many military interventions and coups in different places in the world were either started or supported by a supposedly democratic country supporting democracies around the world? On the more conservative side, the question is often, what are you going to do as a politician when something that benefits the global economy works against the interests of the local economy? What are you willing to prioritize? Where do your allegiances lie? Are you one of my countrymen, or are you a Davos man? Liberalism and the people who have made it what it is today have shown us the power that interconnectivity can have. The question we might have in the 21st century is, what do we really want to do with it? If the Jackson Pollock painting, very aptly named Convergence, is any guide, it would be that there is something both beautiful, complex, and simple and vapid about the tenets of liberalism that can serve a great good or cause great confusion, all at the same time. And like a Pollock painting, the angle from which we approach that complex convergence will decide whether it is something inspiring and useful or just a bunch of random drops.